Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar on forced deportation of Syrian refugees from Lebanon. We have almost 70 people joining us from different countries. Thank you for your interest, and we're glad to know that we have this number despite the short notice, relatively very short notice. My name is Mohammed Masri, Senior Researcher of Access Center for Human Rights, and I will be moderating this session. Just before we start, I'd like to mention that this webinar is being interpreted into Arabic and French, and you can use translation feature to switch from one language to another if you need translation. In case you face any technical issues, please send your request or question to ACHR team. They will be here to support you via chat box. During this 1 hour, please feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A feature as well. And our speakers and colleagues will try to answer as many questions as possible. We have 15 minutes.
على الإجابة على أكبر قدر ممكن من الأسئلة وسيكون هناك وقت في نهاية
Et bon, aujourd'hui, nous avons 4
been working on, let's say, in refugee-related context for years, and I'll briefly introduce them. I'll start by Amanda. Amanda Strayer, she is a supervising staff attorney for accountability at Human Rights First. She coordinates the Targeted Human Rights and Anti-Corruption Sanctions Coalition. For years, she's been working on human rights and to hold abusers of human rights accountable and even corrupt actors as well in the States, Canada, and beyond. Our second speaker is Jenny Beer-Limstam. She's the Information Counseling and Legal Assistance Specialist at Norwegian Refugee Council. Jenny has like over a decade of experience in human rights and international protection of refugees. She also worked in different Asian, African, and Middle Eastern countries, including Lebanon. And we're also joined by Jess Marks. Jess is the Senior Advocate for the Middle East at Refugees International. He has been working on advocating for human rights and reporting on humanitarian crisis and in several countries with focus on areas of conflict, which are like, unfortunately, there are not getting less. What he calls like hard to reach areas, and there are not few. And of course, including Syria and recently Gaza as well. And last but not least, we have Willem States, and he's the Middle East Policy Officer at 1111. He focuses on the internal displaced Syrians and Syrian refugees in the region. He also advocates for meaningful participation of refugees and promotes the role of refugee-led organizations in the region. And of course, if you would like to know more about our speakers and their NGOs, the activities they conduct, please have a look at the registration link that you received and which you registered to this webinar. Maybe like my colleagues can also send this link to the chat box if you may. And you can also find further information. At Access Center for Human Rights, where I work, is a refugee-led organization. We defend the rights of Syrian refugees in Lebanon and advocate for safe, voluntary, and dignified return of Syrians. And we also raise awareness about the violations they endure in Lebanon. You can also have a look at ACHR's website and download our reports. Please, like also my colleagues, please share the link for our last report on forced deportation and what happens to the Syrian refugees who are being forcibly deported back to Syria. Okay. So just let's maybe start by a quick background before I move over to the speakers, to the so maybe like most attendees might have like some background information about the situation in Lebanon. And but maybe just like a brief background. So Syrians in Lebanon are recently like almost 800,000 Syrians registered in Lebanon, and of course, Lebanese politicians, sometimes they say 1.5 million, sometimes 2 million. It depends on the context, especially before Brussels conference. So ACHR documented forcibly deporting around 150 Syrian refugees in 2022. The number increased to over 760 in 2023, and now like these kind of campaigns and deportations usually happen after randomly arresting, let's say, refugees basically in the camps and settlements, and on the checkpoints, random like makeshift checkpoints, and deported back to Syria. So despite the very dire, in addition to the very dire circumstances that refugees face in Lebanon, we talk about poverty, lack of access to education, lack of access to medical services. Now the situation is becoming more and more difficult for them, and especially under like some kind of orchestrated, let's say, or organized systemic campaigns of hate speech, incitement to violence. And these unprecedented violations led to communal evictions in many areas, attacks on abusing of refugees, and even attacking the schools where the children or refugee children they go or attend. And the very huge increase of kidnapping, physical violence, and and what might be worse is forcibly deporting Syrians back to Syria. So Jani, I would like to start by asking you, so when we talk about Syrians in Lebanon very scared of being deported back to Syria, why, like we hear in the media outlet, whether Syrian or Lebanese or some international media outlets, Syria is safe and there are no fighting, or let's say fierce fighting in many areas, most areas of the Syrian map. So why are refugees not voluntarily returning back to Syria?
Thank you. Well, I mean, indeed, there are a lot of suggestions that Syria is safe, but according to a number of human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch and the Syrian Network for Human Rights, thousands of civilians die every year due to torture, disappearance, arbitrary arrest, and this includes children, elderly, and people with disabilities. And also, of course, women and individuals from the LGBTQI community are subjected to this kind of violence. We also have the military subscription, which, of course, many men aged between 18 and 40, I think it changes every now and then, but 45, I guess, that don't want to join the military forces, are afraid to return because they will get arrested and tortured before they're sent to prison and then sent to the front as well. And this is actually also according to knowing that Lebanon hasn't signed the Refugee Convention, but this is a right to seek asylum, because these men are included in a special social group, is what we call it legally. So there are plenty of reasons for why people don't want to return, other than, of course, economic reasons and the sanctions, etc.
Thank you very much for the insights. Yeah, you're definitely right. Like even like in one of the deportation report, like we interviewed like 299 deportees or survivors of deportation, and they mentioned the very same points as well. And yeah, it like someone might say that, oh, Lebanon is facing like some economic crisis, and the Lebanese lira collapsed, but the Syrian lira has collapsed as well. So why not go back home? Yeah. So let's say supposedly, of course, the situation is more.
لنفترض أن الوضع أسوأ ومعقد أكثر بالطبع، ولكن لماذا يذهب السوريين إلى مكان آخر؟ لماذا لا يذهبون إلى أوروبا عوضا عن أن يبقوا في لبنان، جني؟ يتمنى العديد محمد أن يذهب إلى أوروبا بدلا من العودة إلى سوريا، ونرى السوريون واللبنانيون أيضا يغادرون لبنان إلى دول أخرى في طرق غير آمنة إطلاقا لكي يهربون من هذا الواقع. ولكن الطريقة صعبة جدا، إنها أولا مكلفة، ثانيا إنها غير آمنة، وثالثا هناك حالات قليلة من إعادة التوطين الشرعية والآمنة التي تحصل. الطرق للوصول إلى أوروبا هي محدودة وغير آمنة. محمد، شكرا لك جاني. كسوري أريد أن أضيف أن هناك صعوبة للحصول على تأشيرة أو على فيزا إلى أي دولة أوروبية. حتى لو كان السوريون يريدون أن يذهبوا بطريقة شرعية وآمنة إلى هذه الدول، هذا يشكل تحدي كبير من جهة الحصول على الفيزا. نعم، كان يجب أن أذكر ذلك محمد. الطرق البديلة الوحيدة هي الطرق الغير آمنة من التهريب وما إلى هنالك. شكرا لك جاني. ولم أريد أن أتوجه إليك بالسؤال. كما ذكر جاني، لبنان لم يوقع على اتفاقية 1951 والأوضاع صعبة جدا ويواجهون تحديات كثيرة وأيضا تهديدات. حتى ماذا يجب أن يفعل الأشخاص بدل أن يتم ترحيلهم قسريا إلى سوريا؟ عندما نتحدث عن السوريين، اللاجئون السوريون في لبنان، اللاجئون السوريون الفلسطينيون في لبنان، أين يجب أن يذهبوا في هذه الأوضاع؟ حسنا، كما ذكر السوريون الذين ما زالوا في لبنان لم يبقى لديهم خيارات متعددة، أنهم يواجهون تهديد الترحيل القسري إلى سوريا، والطرق الأخرى غير متوفرة، وهذا يترك الأشخاص بخيارات قليلة جدا للوصول إلى أوروبا عبر الوسائل غير الشرعية مثل استخدام المهربين. وهذا ما بدأنا أن نراه. إذا رأيتم الإحصاءات الأخرى من أوروبا في عام 2023 وصلت الأعداد إلى أرقام قياسية مقارنة بالسنوات السابقة، والسوريون يحاولون ذلك وهم بالمرتبة الأولى الذين يذهبون يأخذون طرق اللجوء في أوروبا. قد تفكرون أن هذا قد يحفز السياسات على التغير، ولكن هذا يحصل بطريقة العكسية كما رأينا مؤخرا في سياقات دول أخرى. لم يكن هذا التغير بسياق إيجابي، إنه يحدث بينما نحن نتحدث الآن. تغيير هذه السياسات يحدث بينما نحن نتحدث. إن السوريون يحاولون الهروب من لبنان إلى أوروبا، وأن أوروبا والاتحاد الأوروبي ولبنان يحاولون عقد اتفاقيات هجرة كما حصل سابقا كما حصل بين الاتحاد الأوروبي وتونس ومصر مثلا. ما هو مطروح على الطاولة الآن هو فكرة خاطئة جدا، محفوفة بالمخاطر. الطرق التي يأخذها اللاجئون للهروب محفوفة بالمخاطر، وكما تحدثت تم أيضا مشاركة هذه الخطة الرسمية، خطة رسمية للهجرة، والتي سيتم التحدث عنها الأسبوع القادم في لبنان. يتم الدفع باتجاهها من قبل الحكومة اللبنانية والدول الأوروبية مثل قبرص بشكل خاص. والاتفاقية التي يتم المناصرة باتجاهها والحشد باتجاهها هي لها ثلاث خطوات: دعم مادي للأمن العام في لبنان لمنع السوريون من مغادرة لبنان والوصول إلى قبرص، إعلان سوريا أو بعض مناطق من سوريا كآمنة، والثالثة هو توسيع ترحيل السوريون إلى المناطق الآمنة. هذه الاتفاقية، هذه هي الثلاث أجزاء لهذه الاتفاقية التي يتم مناقشتها بين لبنان والاتحاد الأوروبي. إنها فكرة سيئة جدا، لن تكون معتمدة على الحقائق الموجودة، لن تضمن سلامة السوريين. إنه تفكير بسيط جدا. إنها غير فعالة أيضا، لأنه إذا أردتم أن تضعوا القانون الدولي على جنب، وإذا أردتم مقاربة هذا الموضوع من وجهة نظر سياسية ومن وجهة نظر إدارة الهجرة، أنتم تعطون الأموال للأمن العام اللبناني، والذي هو أيضا مسؤول عن هذه الهجرة، حركة الهجرة إلى أوروبا. إنهم عبر حملات الخوف أو منهج يدفعون الأشخاص إلى الهروب من لبنان، وهي غير فعالة. الطريقة والخطة غير فعالة. بدل أن تحلوا الموضوع، أنتم تضعون ضغط أكبر على الهجرة الغير شرعية التي تحصل باتجاه أوروبا. الخوف يتزايد، وبالتالي الهجرة الغير شرعية تتزايد. إنه حل مؤقت وقصير الأمد. حتى لو كان لبنان على قدر من الاستطاعة بإرسال السوريون إلى سوريا، إذا استطاعوا أن يغلقوا الحدود بين لبنان وسوريا، هذا سيكون ناجح. ولكن سترون
what many organizations, including the UN, different UN bodies have been documenting.
سترون ما تحدثت عنه وكالات الأمم المتحدة المختلفة، وهي ظاهرة السوريون الذين يذهبون إلى سوريا قسرا ويتم ترحيلهم قسرا، يجدون أنفسهم في مكان غير آمن، وسيهربون من سوريا مرة واثنان وثلاثة، وسيكون هناك حلقة مفرغة من التهجير القسري ومن الهروب. وإذا نظرتم إليها من وجهة نظر ضيقة جدا، في أفضل الحالات سترون أنفسكم تحصلون على حل سريع في مدة قصيرة، ولكن هذا الحل السريع سيعيد توجيه السوريون إلى خارج سوريا مرة أخرى، إلى مناطق أخرى، لأنهم سيهربون من هذا الجحيم الذين يتم إرسالهم إليه بطريقة قسرية، وسيذهبون عبر طرق أخرى، تركيا أو إلى طرق أخرى. سيحاولون جهدهم أن يخرجوا من سوريا مرة أخرى لأنها غير آمنة بالنسبة لهم.
Thank you for the very important notes and for the insights. So if we can rephrase this, so the European Union, let's say, or the international community, if we agree on the term, instead of being part of the solution and put pressure on the Lebanese authorities to stop deporting Syrian refugees from Lebanon, or even to put some pressure on the government of Cyprus to stop the pushback campaigns and the kind of in a way or another becoming part of the problem if this policy is adopted. So let's say I'm currently in a refugee camp in Bekaa, and I know that this kind of it's becoming more international crisis or problem, and we kind of people who are not refugees tend to forget about the main core of the issue, which is human beings, people in Lebanon. So when we think about from their perspective, I was in Lebanon, so when we think about someone who's living in Lebanon now, what can they do? Who to reach out So we have international NGOs, we have international community, we have UNHCR and other international organizations, and we have embassies. What shall refugees who are at risk of being deported back to Syria? And we have many cases in our last reports and witnesses of people after being deported, being killed, tortured to death in Syrian government detention centers, being abused, or let's say by human trafficking gangs on the borders. And many of them, even after being deported, they found a way to be smuggled back into Lebanon. So as you mentioned, this is not very sustainable. This is not very, it's not a solution. So back to the question, if I may, what shall people do? What shall we as, let's say, international organizations do to intervene? Like, do you have any suggestions for someone who's now being at risk of being deported in Bekaa Valley, for example, or somewhere else in Lebanon?
Rookie mistake happened soon. I think the number one lesson for policymakers is very clear. Like anyone following even from far the situation in Lebanon should know that any policy that doesn't tackle the issue of forced deportations is doomed to fail. But of course, or unfortunately, what we have been seeing in recent months and years is that the EU, is that the international community at large is not doing that. To the contrary, they're now planning to actually strengthening and forcing and empowering the very same actors responsible for these deportations. But of course, if like the many objections that I and when I say I, 11, we of course we work together with a wide range of local CSO partners, refugee-led organizations themselves. I think what we have been advocating for is not necessary, or we have not necessarily been saying that any kind of a deal between the EU and Lebanon is necessarily a bad idea. On the contrary, I would even say like a deal is long overdue, but it's of course then the question like what kind of a deal? And what we need, what Syrian refugees need in Lebanon is a deal, but a deal that is based or that is grounded in an international law framework, in a durable solutions approach, which would basically consist of international actors telling the government of Lebanon, like, look, what we want to see is no forced deportations, more temporary residencies, more work permits, of course, while recognizing the enormous pressure that you are under, that the country is under. We have to, of course, acknowledge that. So in exchange, we as the EU, as an international community, we stand ready to come to like some kind of quid pro quo. If you do X, Y, Z, we are ready to invest more money in projects and interventions that benefit Lebanese host communities. We stand ready to do actually our fair share in terms of resettling people. We are ready to explore possibilities in terms of economic incentives. That would be a deal that would be a triple win. Basically, it would not only benefit refugees, most importantly, it would benefit host communities in Lebanon, and it would benefit international actors because it would lead to more controlled forms of migration and less people drowning in the Mediterranean.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, I absolutely agree. Like it's a win-win, or as you said, like win-win-win situation for all actors. It's going to be helpful for the Lebanese government, for Lebanese people, and for refugees as well, and for the decision makers in Europe who might be like prioritizing, let's say, the risk of having like a refugee influx in the future. And yeah, that would be very helpful. Before moving to Amanda, maybe like Jenny has a comment. I don't know if you raised your
Yes,
hand.
and just maybe quickly, from a legal perspective, the only thing that protects a Syrian in Lebanon right now is legal residency. And it's very difficult to get. You can either get legal residency based on your registration with UNHCR before 2015, or if you have a sponsor through work. So it's extremely difficult. Only 17% of the Syrians in Lebanon have legal residency, which is something that really, as you say, the international community, etc., should advocate for. That's just a brief comment to that.
Thank you. Just to add on your comment as well, we've all been watching like statements by tens of Lebanese municipalities saying we will kick out everyone or evict everyone who is not legal in Lebanon, which means 90% of Syrian refugees. So, and they are not legal, they're not legally registered in the let's say they don't have residency documents because of the Lebanese government. Like they're not making this easier for anyone, even if you are a student, even if you are, let's say, a doctor, an engineer, a lawyer, whatsoever, all not easy to get any documentation, any residency documents. And I think, let's say, I believe even the regulation that was, I believe in 2017, I'm not sure about the date, when the Lebanese authorities decided that Syrians are only allowed to work in 3 major sectors: agriculture, construction, and cleaning, I guess. Like only 3 majors. Everyone else will never be legal unless they have a Lebanese guarantor. And it's living there for 5 years, I believe, like it was almost impossible, a nightmare for most refugees. So the vast majority, they don't even have documents. They don't even have residency papers, as you mentioned. Thanks, Jenny. Amanda, before, like building on what Willem already said, so the situation in Lebanon is getting more and more complicated. Violations of human rights of Syrian refugees in the country are on the rise, and they're rocketing, and it's becoming like a living hell for the majority. Many politicians are using like the rhetoric, let's say hate speech, spreading hate speech, even sometimes encouraging locals to act and to kick out or evict refugees from their places, and which led to many cases within Lebanon and beyond the Lebanese borders as well. So whether the ones who violated these human rights and abused Syrians within Lebanon or beyond back to Syria, send them back to Syria where they are at risk of being tortured, arrested, or killed, and they have no access to go to their original homes. Let's say, like, this is a violation of international law, but how is that against international law? When we say a violation of international law, what is Lebanon violating when deporting refugees? What is Lebanon violating when they encourage this kind of rhetoric and this kind of hate speech, like orchestrated hate speech against refugees?
Sure. Thanks, Mohammed, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation today. When we're talking about these kinds of forced deportations, as Jenny and Willem have been describing, in the context of individuals being sent back to Syria in a place where their safety and their well-being is not guaranteed. These are breaches of Lebanon's obligations under the UN Convention Against Torture and customary international law principles of non-refoulement, which is essentially the concept that states are not allowed to force people to return to places where they face a credible fear or risk of torture or other forms of persecution. So within this context, it's really clear that these types of forced deportations would be in violation of Lebanon's obligations under the treaty, but also this principle of non-refoulement. When we talk about these types of human rights violations, and I think has been laid out the situation, perhaps with domestic law in Lebanon, but perhaps with other international mechanisms is a little bit bleak with respect to accountability. When these kinds of forms of international accountability may be out of reach or non-existent. One of the things that we've seen a real growing interest among civil society groups is in advocating for targeted Magnitsky-style sanctions. So I'd love to spend a little bit of time talking about that this morning and helping explain these to folks who maybe have heard the term before, but or haven't and are interested in what types of accountability actions civil society can perhaps pursue and participate in. So Magnitsky-style sanctions, they don't take the place of other forms of accountability, but they can be a really powerful strategy to seek tangible consequences on actors that are responsible for these types of abuses. So just to break down, what are Magnitsky sanctions? They are targeted sanctions imposed against actors for a really wide range of human rights abuses or corruption. They can be applied to both state and to non-state actors, individuals as well as entities like military units. These sanctions are targeted, which means they're applied directly to specific named perpetrators or persons, and they're not applied to entire countries or to entire economic sectors. So they do a much better job ensuring that those responsible for the abuses are the ones that are suffering the consequences of these sanctions. These consequences are threefold. The first is that any individual that is sanctioned is automatically denied the ability to entry for the U.S. if the U.S. is imposing the sanctions. So they're ineligible to obtain a U.S. visa. The second is any assets that they would have in the United States are frozen. They're not seized, but because the assets are frozen, the individual is not able to sell or transact or in any way access those funds. And thirdly, the sanctions impose a block on all financial transactions with the sanctioned person and anybody in the United States. So that could be individuals, it could be U.S. companies or U.S. banks. And this often has a really huge downstream effect for individuals because of the global influence of the U.S. financial system and U.S. banks. So it can have really dramatic consequences for people, even if they think they have no exposure to the U.S. financial system. And then kind of the fourth main consequence is that all of these sanctions are publicly announced, and the reasons for which the sanctions are imposed are also publicly announced. So there's a really powerful name and shame aspect to these sanctions. These tools are used pretty often. In the U.S., they've been used more than 550 times in the last 6 years, in more than 50 countries, including Lebanon. They've been used to target military units and leaders, prison officials, law enforcement units, human trafficking operations, and more, up to quite senior level officials. And the U.S. uses these tools in response to a really wide range of different types of human rights abuses and corruption. So things like torture and cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment or punishment are very widely sanctioned. Extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detentions, even forced deportations. These are all the types of conduct and abuses that we see regularly sanctioned under these types of tools. And the U.S. isn't alone in having this. The UK, the EU, Canada, and Australia also have really similar sanctions mechanisms to target human rights abusers and corrupt actors. So while these countries often work alone or act alone in imposing sanctions, we do also see them trying to coordinate their use in a way to try to enhance the impact of the sanctions. And I'll just wrap up to say, one of, I think, the most remarkable aspects of this tool is how often the U.S. government has used evidence from civil society groups in its decisions to target and sanction human rights abusers and corrupt actors. To date, about 1 in every 3 global Magnitsky sanctions from the U.S. has a basis in civil society recommendations. So civil society is playing a really key role in how these tools are used and identifying the situations where they could have the greatest impact. Civil society works to prepare and submit evidence files that identify targets for sanctions, that present evidence of their roles in human rights abuses, and that press the U.S. government to act. So in my role at Human Rights First, I help run a global coalition of more than 300 civil society groups and work in partnership with many that are interested in doing this kind of work in any country around the world, and would really welcome the opportunity to connect with folks who are listening and who would like to learn more about how this all works. I'll also note too that in addition to these kind of economic sanctions, the US also has a number of visa restriction programs that it uses in response to these types of human rights abuses. But for all these programs, there's obviously no guarantee of US government action, but we have seen a number of incredibly impactful sanctions based on civil society recommendations, and these recommendations continue to be an avenue for public accountability that advocates are seeking in order to curb and deter human rights abuses. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Just a quick question or follow-up question on what you already mentioned. These are very important issues to take into consideration, especially, let's say, the role of the civil society of participating in designing these sanctions or advocating for these sanctions against the ones who violate human rights and the ones who make refugees at risk, and being whether politicians or leaders, religious leaders, local, let's say, leaders as well. So, as you know, like Lebanon, or many politicians in Lebanon, they mentioned that they don't even recognize UN decisions, and it's even now mentioned by also one of the politicians that in rule of law countries like the UK, for example, they are also planning to deport refugees. Why not Lebanon? So we're facing, let's say, if we're talking from the Lebanese authorities' perspective, we're facing financial trouble. Let's scapegoat, in a way or another, refugees, and let's deport them. Everyone is doing this. We can do that too. Are they going to be held accountable? Do we have success stories when it comes to Lebanon? You mentioned tens of cases, but when we talk about Lebanon, do we have success stories? Do we have people sanctioned? Or when we talk about Syria, is it going to, let's say, to be effective? Or because many doubt the impact of sanctions when it comes to political leaders who can find a way to escape these kind of sanctions.
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. And what kind of impact these sanctions have is one that we've been studying quite closely over the past few years. I think it's something where sanctions are not a one-size-fits-all solution, and they're really most impactful and effective when they're combined with a commitment from the government imposing the sanctions to really try to use it as part of a broader diplomatic effort and foreign policy response to the issue. Kind of firing one-off sanctions isn't really a useful way to think about how these tools could be really impactful. But we have, in a number of countries around the world, we have seen situations where sanctions have had and the follow-on foreign policy engagement from the U.S. government has had a really positive impact in terms of stopping, decreasing human rights abuses that these entities have committed. That's not always the case, though. A lot of times, the sanctions are you maybe have other forms of impact. We have seen situations where individuals have been forced from office because of sanctions that have been imposed on them. We have seen situations where the individuals themselves or their family members have suffered financial or other personal consequences because of the inability to travel to the U.S. or these impacts can also be increased the more countries that are working together to sanction the same individuals. So it's one thing for someone to be blocked from the U.S. financial market and entering the U.S., but if the UK and the EU and Canada, if they all join together on sanctions, that can really start to create quite limiting situation for the sanctioned individuals. So I think it's one of the things that we know do result from the sanctions are those tangible impacts on the individual. And I think there's a really huge public accountability piece to the sanctions that's really valuable for victims and for civil society groups that, again, may have very limited access to traditional accountability or justice mechanisms in their own country or through various international forums. Sanctions, they put these kinds of human rights abuse issues on a sort of public agenda in a way that few other things do. There's lots of media reporting about the sanctions, about the reasons why the sanctions were imposed. It can help galvanize local civil society groups that are agitating or pushing for reform or accountability. It can help spur further actions and legitimize the claims of victims. And so I think it's really, in terms of being able to say for sure what the impact is, it's very case dependent. But I think there's a really broad range of potential impacts, especially when governments remain focused on the issue and really try to use the sanctions as a point of leverage with the governments. I think perhaps maybe as Willem was talking about earlier, if you have these bilateral or multilateral conversations with the sanctioned individuals and their governments to say, we have imposed these sanctions for this particular reason, for your involvement in these particular types of human rights abuses. And here's the actions we want to see you stop doing in order for us to consider lifting the sanctions. That kind of creates more opportunities to put pressure and leverage on a situation that may be less possible without sanctions. So all that to say is what the impact is can be really, really varied, but they can be really, really useful diplomatic tools.
Thank you very much. I have many questions in my mind. Of course, I'm not going to ask all of them today, but I'm so curious about, let's say, I will get back to you later, but and maybe also to check the website and learn more about how sanctions work in general and the limitations of the sanction and the efficiency as well. Thank you very much, Amanda. So, Jess, in 2017, you might remember that when there was a campaign led by Hezbollah in Lebanon to encourage voluntary return of Syrian refugees, and it was kind of organized by local municipalities and some groups, even some refugees tried to find a way if they can go back to Syria. They registered, hundreds registered actually in 2017. Most of them were rejected by the Syrian regime after that. In a way or another, and of course, the numbers who decided to voluntarily return, there were very few compared to the total number of refugees in Lebanon. So it failed. There was later in 2018, there was another campaign, and the General Security decided to, let's say, to not to take any, let's say, fees from Syrians, even the ones who had to pay. Let's say, I believe it was $200 per year for the ones who extended or let's say their residency papers were expired, so they have to pay fines. So they were, in order to encourage them, say okay, you don't need to pay any money, just go back to Syria. And it also failed. Then there was kind of another campaign in 2019, another campaign in 2022. Is this an effective way of solving Lebanon's problem? Is this kind of forced deportation? Why do they keep doing it if it is not effective? And if it's effective, please share your point of view as well.
Thank you, Mohammed, and thanks to ACHR for hosting me. It's really a pleasure to get to be with you all and to work with you again on this, very timely and important issue. Even I think you mentioned in the news yesterday about the statement about the UK and the plan to do a broader registration or at least survey of Syrians, unregistered Syrians, to identify status as particularly timely. I think to your specific question, when we think about durable solutions, so the conditions, the ideal solutions that are laid out by the international community and the humanitarian community, right? We think of resettlement, we think of integration in host countries, and we think of voluntary repatriation. Voluntary repatriation is often the hardest to facilitate, but the first that host countries go to, because in their mind it's the easiest to reach some immediate alleviation or perceived alleviation of the economic challenges of hosting refugees. We saw Jordan, we've seen Turkey, and we've seen Lebanon revert and lean very heavily onto repatriation, and I put quotations marks around repatriation because the voluntary nature of these returns are very much so in question. And in certain cases, we don't even have to have a conversation or interrogation of the word voluntary, because they are, as we saw in 2023, numerous occasions, forced at the utmost well-evidenced, well-documented through your reporting, through reporting from other rights groups and humanitarian organizations. So this is not an effective way to solve Lebanon's problems. I make that argument because when you look at what Lebanon's problems are, they're economic, they're political, to some extent they're social. Lebanon is in the midst of one of the most severe economic downturns. It's dealing with soaring inflation, massive job loss, reduced access to basic goods and services, not just for Syrians, but for Lebanese individuals themselves. And these specific conditions have intensified the plight both of Syrians and their Lebanese neighbors. And both groups are sinking together into poverty with limited prospects for relief, particularly from the state. So the challenge here is that state institutions, crippled by corruption and just failure, have deteriorated, leaving major gaps in the ability at the central level to address support for, or even just basic solution finding for affected communities. So as you mentioned, and as has been mentioned by fellow panelists here, it's devolved to the regions and to the governments to solve. And this has created, a widespread range of acute challenges for Syrians, from being kicked out of their homes to, children not being able to have education, to having, whether it's raids, we've seen, armed groups raiding camps, checkpoints set up. The further you get out and you diffuse that responsibility to governorates from the center, the harder it is to address these issues uniformly. And politically, elites have deflected responsibility for, governance. And Syrians have been a very easy scapegoat for them, especially when it comes to tensions within the host community. They've been able to, fuel public backlash against Syrian refugees as a way of deflecting kind of frustration and criticism on what has been just an erroneous and deeply troubling political situation. And the challenge is, we see this in Turkey as well. This isn't a new situation when it comes to the Syrian refugee crisis. We see it in Jordan as well, is that until you can figure out how to reverse that, the perceived solution is we'll just push back the people who are, at least in public media, are being perceived as the problem. And that's largely an easy thing to do because you see Syrian refugees in the street, you see them in the market, you see them wherever you go in Lebanon. And it's easier for a Lebanese citizen who is hungry, whose state is not providing the basic resources and services, seeing a Syrian refugee receive food assistance, to be angry and to rile up a sense of anti-Syrian sentiment and work within those collective communities or engage within those kind of political campaigns. I'm not sure what we call them here, but those political streams that are calling for Syrians to go back. So no, it doesn't actually solve the fundamental problems that Lebanon is facing. But what it does is it creates an unrealistic day-to-day life that Syrians have to live in, where it's, as we saw even in one of the comments here on that, I think says it really well. Folks are hiding in their homes. They don't feel the freedom to move. When I was in Lebanon last, Syrian colleagues were telling me they didn't want to, and in many cases advised Syrian staff not to go out during the major deportations in and around Beirut because they were fearful that their staff would be taken and be deported. And we saw, through the work, again, of ACHR and other organizations, exactly what happened to those who were deported back, particularly those who were sent to prisons in Damascus. And, cases of torture. Of course, in most cases, folks smuggle their way back into Lebanon in the end, so it doesn't actually solve the problem. But I think more tragically, Willem, as you mentioned, we're seeing people increasingly look to the sea. And that creates a really deadly dynamic, is because if you're a Syrian who sees the sea as an option and you end up in a sinking boat, your future is getting deported back to Syria one way or another. It's because the Lebanese authorities will intercept the boat. You get to shore, you're driven to the border, and you're pushed back across, and you're dealing with the same situation as if you just left or were forced back. So no, I don't think this is an effective way of solving Lebanon's problems. But the challenge is there are not a number of alternatives that they see on the horizon, because the international community is not fulfilling its commitment and its burden sharing to support Lebanon. And I also understand, a number of the arguments that have been made regarding, the international community not funding the Lebanese armed forces or looking at, implementing the human rights mechanisms within a lot of defense assistance, whether that's on the U.S. side or otherwise. I think all this have to be looked at to try to curb the participation of Lebanese authorities in the deportation of Syrians. But it's a tricky situation, like looking at, how do you support refugees and how do you build the capacity of a state, which in many cases the government doesn't see the will to kind of push through the current crisis, prolonged crisis at this point, to actually develop good governance mechanisms that actually could, in theory, find ways forward to integrate Syrians, at least in the near term, right? You had a lot of high-skilled labor. You had a lot of refugees with skills who came across who, for political reasons, for security reasons, can't go back to Syria, who, can fill a lot of voids. So there's a lot of ways of thinking through tactically and strategically how to turn, a refugee crisis into an economic opportunity. But there's no mechanisms or institutions in place within the state that would allow for any strategic thinking. And so long as they're beating the drum of just go home, just go home, just go home, that's not an actual solution. It's the political rhetoric that creates further problems. I'll pause there.
Thank you very much for the important notes, and yeah, you're definitely right when it comes also to the point that it's forced even when it seems voluntary. Like so when someone is like his family or her family is evicted from their house, they don't have a passport, even a valid passport. It's very expensive to get one. If they get, it's almost impossible to get a visa somewhere else. And at the same time, like a member of the family is a defected a soldier from the Syrian army, or they don't want to go back and shoot their own people. And at the same time, they don't have legal residency. They're not allowed to work. And they keep saying that this is the solution, that you leave the country. And as you mentioned, there is a lot of opportunity as well. Like the number of Lebanese nurses is very low, and at some point there were hundreds of Syrian nurses in Lebanon, and still the Lebanese authorities decided not to benefit from the existence of many highly skilled Syrians in the country, and most of them left the country. So kind of it gives, let's say, kind of it makes us doubt whether Syrian authorities really need to solve the problem or care about the civilians, their own civilians. Yeah, and the point you mentioned about, let's say, the Lebanese authorities, when many international NGOs and even regional NGOs and local NGOs, they started including Lebanese in their programs, and it became kind of slightly better. But at the same time, it's now becoming more institutional. Let's fund the institutions, the government institutions. So it's a very complicated situation, as you mentioned. I will also get back to you in a few minutes. Thank you very much. So, Jenny, over to you. Let's say, why is Lebanon always scapegoating Syrians? Is it different from other countries? Like Turkey is scapegoating Syrians. Other countries are kind of, let's say, making refugees the main problem in the country, the main challenge of the failure of the economy, or let's say the challenges of the population face. Why did Lebanon decide or keep deciding to scapegoat refugees from your point of view?
Yeah, I think there are many reasons, of course. One being historical and goes back to the Lebanese civil war, where Syrians were involved, and many Lebanese do have traumatic memories of that. But I mean, for more recently, I think it's, as you mentioned, there is the the age bias that many think that the Syrians are getting, and there's a lot of rumors like Syrians are getting hundreds of dollars per month from the UN, which is in no way correct, of course. There is the bias that people come and steal jobs, which is also not true, because as you said, Syrians are only allowed to work in those 3 areas. And this is something that they have been doing for many years before the outbreak of the Syria conflict as well. And then I think it's just because it's easy. It's easy to scapegoat the Syrians when your own country is not going well. We saw the Thawra, or the revolution in Lebanon, which didn't lead to anything. And there was no changes in any policy or politics, basically. So, there weren't any reforms taken or anything done by the Lebanese or the Lebanese government to improve the situation. So it's just been constantly going from bad to worse. And I think also, to be honest, and this is something we've seen very much lately, like since, the amount of hate speech and anti-refugee rhetoric's been going, increasing a lot the last year. But so really in 2023, it became so normalized that even groups that previously had supported Syrians, now it just had become the new normal, and it's fine to express this hatred on social media, etc. And it's kind of, this fueled everyone's opinion about refugees. So it kind of seems like condoning the worst treatments of Syrians and the restrictions. Not only did we see that in by the government in terms of the raids and the deportations that started really being implemented last year, because the rule of deportation of Syrians, the decision by the government, it came to 2019 already in April, that anyone who has not crossed the border regularly could be deported. But this wasn't really implemented until last year. And we also saw these decisions of the municipalities and decisions or requests to the Ministry of Justice not to issue power of attorney, etc. So it's been like a downward spiral, that everything together. And now we see the campaigns this year, the Undo the Damage campaign. It's just getting so much more acceptable to express your hatred against the Syrians.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Yeah, I also definitely agree with what you said about 13 years of Syrian army invasion of Lebanon and the historical reasons behind this tension, or let's say societal tension, when it comes to Syrian refugees in Lebanon, despite they both suffered from the same perpetrator. They both suffered from the Syrian regime in a way or another. And yeah, when in 2019, when the Supreme Defense Council announced that they're planning to deport everyone who entered illegally, which means almost like no one is illegal, but that's the terminology they use. But when we see like 90%
Irregularly, we call it.
Irregularly, yes. Like, so we see like 90% of Syrians who are living in Lebanon, they don't have access even. They don't have the privilege to get these residency documents for many reasons, and many of them, they were pushed from the cities and villages of the Syrian-Lebanese borders due to the intervention of Hezbollah. So it's definitely very, very complicated, but what's unfortunate is channeling people's anger towards the victims, towards the ones who are most vulnerable, because as you said, like, it's very easy. So we can't change the government, we can't change the situation, so let's scapegoat refugees. Thank you very much, Jenny. So I will turn to Willem. So let's say you mentioned the EU-Lebanon deal, and I'm not sure if there's a way to intervene or to stop this kind of deal, or to advocate for, or if the advocacy is going to be effective or it's already done. And are there, can you share more about the sustainable solutions, sustainable alternatives of this EU-Lebanon deal? Other speakers already mentioned some suggestions, but if you can illustrate more, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. Well, as I said before, I think the bulk of it would be like this, coming to some kind of deal, but a more positive quid pro quo that results in a win-win-win for everybody involved. That being said, I think there's of course other things that international actors can do. Also, as we are ironically, maybe in a way, we're also on the verge of yet another Brussels VIII conference now, which will start next week, 2 days before von der Leyen will head to Beirut. So of course, there's a lot of things that international actors, international donors can and should do as a matter of urgency, of course. I think when it comes to the issue of returns, I think for starters, like and as basic as it may sound, like hold the line on the fact that Syria is not safe for return, and you don't have to take me or 11s or like the other speakers' word for it. Like, just base yourself on reports that have been issued in the past 2 months alone by the United Nations, by UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, by the UN Commission of Inquiry, by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and in a European context, also not unimportantly, last week, by the European Union Asylum Agency, the body mandated to make that assessment by the EU, which published a new update on their Syria country guidance just last week. So by the time that von der Leyen will head to Beirut, it will be just 2 weeks or so that the EU's own asylum body has very clearly stated, like, no, Syria is not safe to return to. And then the EU's chief will go to Beirut and potentially say the exact opposite. That's of course not, regardless of where you stand in this debate, that's not really good policy. And I think the basic line there should be that, like, okay, if Lebanon and or others do think that all these bodies are wrong, okay, fine, but then let's test it and put in place. If they are so sure that conditions are in place, let's test it. Let's put in place a structural international mechanism to monitor conditions for safe, voluntary, dignified return, to monitor UN conditions, because there are very specific UN conditions to make that assessment. And if, and that's a big if, that mechanism does exist, and if then, another big if, that mechanism does confirm that indeed over a sustained period of time conditions have been met, of course, then let's talk returns, but in that sequence and not the other way around. So I think that's one thing that international Western governments should be very firm on, very much pushing. Another thing, of course, has to do with funding. Not only the volume, which is guess, the obvious recommendation to make. But yeah, there also the very obvious observation to make is that the needs have increased exponentially. So yeah, the budget should follow, and if not, then one should not be surprised that people are seeking other options. But volume of funding is one thing. The quality of funding is another thing. So that's why I think it's also important that there's the Brussels conference next week, but also beyond, there's like a revived discussion on how to spend that money, like the quality of the aid provided, and then you talk about, or that one should, that's maybe an important nuance, one should, not necessarily one is doing that, but one should discuss around how to meaningfully involve refugees and organizations often representing them, or organizations that consist of refugee-led organizations, how to make sure that they are meaningfully involved in the design, the intervention, the evaluation of interventions to get better policies, better interventions. So that's another major thing to do. And of course, it also has to do with, or the EU can only push for any such measures or hold Lebanon to account on international law violations if they are not violating international law themselves, which they are basically doing, EU member states, on an almost daily basis with pushbacks. So there, I think also the message should be very clear, like get your own house in order and illegal pushbacks. And also now, as we see in Cyprus, the suspension of asylum procedures for Syrians, and then have discussion with Lebanon, or simultaneously have discussion with Lebanon on how they should and could respect international law.
Yeah, definitely. And so this kind of these unconditional funding of Lebanese authorities is not only unethical, it's also against European policy and European conclusions of their own analysis and reports that tens, maybe hundreds of European organizations and even governments, bodies, they concluded that Syria is not safe and still going with this. So that's very unfortunate, but thank you so much for the important input as well. So let's say, it's not easy. Actually, we're running out of time, so I will make it. I'll wrap up before we move to the questions. But I would like to move to Amanda. So Amanda, in the future, we're talking about sanctions and we're talking about the impact or the sanctioning individuals or institutions. Would that affect Lebanese population, let's say civilians, or is it very carefully aiming at particular individuals and people will not feel it? Because like many people say now that it did not impact the Iraqi regime earlier or the Syrian, the Assad regime nowadays. But the impact on civilians, on population is very difficult. Would such sanctions, whether we're talking about Magnitsky or other sanctions, or even if we talk about Syria, Captagon Act and Caesar Act or Caesar Act, would these kind of sanctions, if applied to Lebanon case, affect Lebanese people, or that has minimum impact?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's one that a lot of folks have concerns about when we start talking about sanctions, because they do, there's such a negative history for sanctions for many, many years. The type of sanctions I've been talking about today, Magnitsky-style sanctions, are what we call targeted sanctions or smart sanctions. They're different from the kind of countrywide or economic sector-wide sanctions that we've seen used in places like Iraq in the past, where the main critique was that the impacts of those sanctions were felt most acutely by just regular citizens of the country and not the leadership, not the individuals in the regime that were most responsible for the the reason for which the sanctions were imposed. So these targeted sanctions, these smart sanctions, are very specifically targeted only against the individuals or the entities that are named in the sanctions. So, if a senior government minister or a commander of a military unit is sanctioned, it's only that individual who is sanctioned, and any entities, businesses, for example, that they own or control. Likewise, if a military unit or a law enforcement unit is sanctioned, it is just that unit that is sanctioned. And so part of the interest in these sanctions is that they are meant to really ensure that the consequences, the detrimental consequences of these sanctions are falling most acutely on the individuals who are most responsible for the human rights abuses, and not on their victims, not on other individuals that are not playing any role in these patterns of abuse.
Thanks, Amanda, for the very insightful points. I will turn to Jess, please. So, what would be the regional impact, if we're not talking about the international, let's say the regional impact of deporting Syrians and carrying on this kind of forced deportation campaigns?
Yeah, I think we run the risk of normalizing deportation as a kind of preferred means of solving issues. I mean, we've seen it in Lebanon. We've seen it in Turkey. It's happening overwhelmingly in Pakistan. It has a history of happening in Pakistan. And Jordan's experimented with it in the past. Granted, in Jordan, which is potentially the last shoe to drop, to borrow the phrase, there has been a larger willingness to pursue, I would say, more gray areas to facilitate voluntary return. But I think the core point here is one that I think Willem made very powerfully, which is that Syria is not safe. And until you solve the issue in Syria at the root, the crisis and challenge in neighboring countries is going to be ongoing. The Syrians, until now, despite Lebanon and other governments' claims that it has improved, and certainly in some areas there is marked, less fighting. But that doesn't mean that there's less oppression. It doesn't mean that there's, fewer economic challenges, mobility to be able to actually start a job, get funding, even rebuild their homes. Like, the situation in Syria writ large makes it that much harder for folks to go back and actually start a new life. Layer on top of that the concerns and the evidence of torture, forced disappearances, and these other things that play out. So I think we run the risk of normalizing repatriation as the go-to de facto policy solution to what is a much more nuanced issue that requires not just simply throwing people on buses and saying, get out, but, actually doing the hard work of improving conditions inside of Syria, of utilizing diplomacy to kind of reach better solutions, enabling the UN to actively fulfill their mandate, whether that's in monitoring returnees or at a basic level registering refugees, right? So, and we see this play out in Lebanon in really problematic ways where, Lebanon no longer even has the right to their own data, with the Lebanese government, right, mandating that they hand over refugee data. So I think that type of reality could play out in other conflicts. And I'm thinking in Latin America, I'm thinking potentially in the future with Ukraine. Like, as refugee crises become more protracted, it becomes harder for host countries to figure out exactly what is the best solution. And I think that's where the international community has to be more forward-leaning, not in forgetting about crises and not in moving on from them. I understand that money moves and migrates to new crises, especially with Sudan and Gaza flaring up. But the Syrian refugee crisis is still one of the largest, and it's still one of the most acute. And we're seeing, record levels of violence not seen since 2017, 2018 in the country right now. And arguably that this crisis, when it comes to sheer capital and numbers of people, is still one of the worst in the world. And neighboring countries are not any closer to solving that challenge. So the international community has to pick up and really, burden the responsibility to help Syrian refugees and to an extent, like, help the countries that are hosting them, rather than that normalization of deportation.
These are very important comments as well, and I really want to discuss it further, but unfortunately we're running out of time. So I'm maybe just get like a couple questions as within like the 1 or 2 more minutes. And so one of the questions is actually usually very under-discussed and very few talk about it, which is people who are defected from the Syrian army, people who are in Lebanon. They don't have documents, they don't have passports, they don't have any way to leave. And human rights defenders and activists in Lebanon, if any of you would like to answer the question, what would be the solution for someone who's literally stuck in Lebanon, very immobile and can't go, can't return, and the risk from our reports as well of being tortured and killed even before the conscription is very high. The risk is very high. So are there any suggestions, solutions for this issue for human rights defenders and military defects, or someone who's a very high risk of being killed when, or let's say tortured when they return?
I mean, I'll just briefly jump in and say I think this is why the durable solutions exist, right? It's not like the only option is not send them back, right? This is where the international community has to step up its vetting and resettlement process, right? You have to streamline that process. You have to put in the time, the money, and the commitments. You have, and you know, that's a political debate ongoing in the U.S., but like, you know, donor countries have to step up. They have to create the space to provide resettlement pathways for people and legal pathways more generally who have no other option. They cannot physically go back due to the risk. I mean, but that's increasingly political and challenging to do. But there's, you know, there are other options, I think, on the table that have to be explored. You know, we've heard conversations about, like, is there a way to create some form of inter-Middle Eastern refugee status that allows people to move to other countries to work with high-skilled labor? You know, are there private pathways, sponsorship pathways? But all of those things that help pull the most vulnerable out of conflict environments who can't go back are critical.
Yes,
yes, please, Danny.
Sorry, quickly. The problem is, though, if you don't have any ID documents, nothing to show who you are, you can't get resettled. This is number one rule. I mean, this is what NRC, we provide civil documentation, legal residency all the time. But if there is no passport or no national ID card, there's not much we can do.
I think that highlights the importance of reform. I mean, at the state level, and there's still a big piece of this, which the Lebanese government still plays a role in this process.
Yeah, even when you have documents, it might be like everyone is a suspect. Everyone is, Rafat al-Assad was not a suspect when he moved to France a few decades ago, but now like everyone who's an activist, even unfortunately for many countries, regional and international. Yeah. So it's not easy for human rights defenders and advocates, and the ones who decided not to keep fighting, or the ones who decided not to shoot other civilians in their country. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. Thank you very much. It was really interesting, and I enjoyed all your questions. And thanks for everyone who attended. And I'm sorry for not being able to answer all the questions. Many of them were actually answered during the discussion, but some of the questions we missed answering them. And so for everyone who's listening, for our attendees, please, if you're a decision maker or an advocate, please keep advocating, speaking up for refugees. And this is a very important issue, and it's not getting any easier. Syria is definitely not safe. Please advocate for resettlement, for non-refoulement, for anything would be helpful and hundreds of thousands of Syrians in Lebanon are waiting for our support and for our action as well. Thank you, and this webinar is going to be already being recorded, and it's going to be uploaded on the website. So we will share the link later, And please, if you can find it, and if you're interested, you can listen to the discussion if you missed parts of it. Thank you very much, and we will see you in future events.
Thank you for joining. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for participating.
Recording.